Here's the key here to the Old Testament reliability, which we're privy to have for our benefit. The Masoretes were the Jewish scholars who between AD 500 and AD 950 gave the final form to the text of the Old Testament, and that's what we have today available in the original language as updated by the Masoretes, so that we have a very reliable Old Testament, upon which the New Testament quotes a lot. So we had both Testaments have to be reliable. So the Masoretes were the Jewish scholars who between AD 500 and AD 950 gave the final form to the text of the Old Testament. The destruction of the temple in AD 70, along with the dispersion of the Jews from their land, became a powerful impetus to, number one, standardize the consonantal text, and two, standardize punctuation and the use of vowels to preserve correct vocalization so they could read it, which is a tradition, and pronunciation for reading. They were called Masoretics because they preserved in writing the oral tradition, the marara, concerning the correct vowels and accents. Pardon me if I don't pronounce these words correctly. And the number of occurrences of rare words of unusual spellings. They received the unpointed, comparable to English without vowels, consonantal text of the Sopherim, and inserted the vowel points that gave to each word its exact pronunciation and grammatical form. They even engaged in a moderate amount of textual criticism, wherever they suspected that the word indicated by the consonantal text was erroneous. They corrected it in a very ingenious way. There's an oral tradition here, and this is why they did their work, and it's so remarkable. They left the actual consonants undisturbed, as they had received them from the Sopherim, but they inserted vowel points that belonged to the new words they were substituting for the old, and then inserted the consonants of the new word itself in very small letters in the margin. They were very, very meticulous, wanting to make sure they weren't arrogant, saying, "This is it." They did the best they could, and it's excellent. The Masoretes were well disciplined and treated the text with the greatest imaginable reverence, and devised a complicated system of safeguards against scribal slips. They counted, for example, the number of times each letter of the alphabet occurs in each book. They pointed out the middle letter of the Pentateuch and the middle letter of the whole Hebrew Bible, and made even more detailed calculations than these. Everything countable seems to be counted, says Wheeler Robinson, an author on this, scholar on this, and they made up mnemonics by which the various totals might be readily remembered. Checks and balances. There were two major schools or centers of Masoretic activity, each largely independent of the other, allowing for now comparative comparisons of their works, making it even more an accuracy. The Babylonian and the Palestinian. The most famous Masoretes were the Jewish scholars living in Tiberias in Galilee, Moses ben Asher with his son Aaron, and Moses ben Naphtali in the late 9th and 10th centuries. The Ben Asher text is the standard Hebrew text today and is best represented by Codex Leningradensis B19 A and L and the Aleppo Codex. The Masoretes, from Masorah meaning tradition, accepted the laborious job of editing the text and standardizing it. Their headquarters was in Tiberias. The text which the Masoretes concluded with is called the Masoretic text. The resultant text had vowel points added in order to ensure proper pronunciation. And so the Masoretic text is the standard Hebrew text today. The Masoretes were well disciplined and treated the text with the greatest imaginable reverence, and devised a complicated system of safeguards against scribal slips. They counted, for example, the number of times each letter of the alphabet occurs in each book. They pointed out the middle letter of the Pentateuch and the middle letter of the whole Hebrew Bible, and made each more detailed calculations than these. Everything countable seems to be counted, says Wheeler Robinson, and they made up mnemonics by which the various totals might be readily remembered. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian from the Romans, 1st century, writes, "We have given practical proof of our reverence for our own scriptures, for although such long ages have now passed, No one has ventured either to add or to remove or to alter a syllable, and it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and, if need be, cheerfully to die for them. Time and again, ere now, the sight has been witnessed of prisoners enduring tortures and death in every form in the theaters, rather than utter a single word against the laws and the allied documents. The scribes could tell if one consonant was left out of, or say, the entire book of Isaiah or the entire Hebrew Bible. They built in so many safeguards that they knew when they finished that they had an exact copy. Sir Frederick Kenyon says, besides recording varieties of reading, tradition, and conjecture, the Masoretes undertook a number of calculations which did not enter into the ordinary sphere of textual criticism. They numbered the verses, vowels, and letters of every book. They calculated the middle word and the middle letter of each. They enumerated verses which contain all the letters of the alphabet, or a certain number of them, and so on. These trivialities, as we may rightly consider them, but had yet the effect of securing minute attention to the precise transmission of the text, and they are but an excessive manifestation of a respect for the sacred scriptures, which in itself deserves nothing but praise. The Masoretes were indeed anxious that not one jot nor tittle, not the one smallest letter, nor one tiny part of a letter or of the law should pass away or be lost. We should follow such a disciplined tradition. I'm always shocked when I ask people, what must I do to be saved? They say, well, ask Jesus to come into your heart. And they go, where's that in Scripture? Well, what does that matter to you? It matters everything. Did some person editorialize that, or is that really directly from God through inspiration through the human authors? The fact that it runs throughout the above discussion of the Hebrew manuscript evidences is the Jewish reverence for the Scriptures. With respect to the Jewish Scriptures, however, it was not scribal accuracy alone that guaranteed their product. Rather, it was their almost superstitious reverence for the Bible. According to the Talmud, there were specifications not only for the kind of skins to be used and the size of the columns, but the scribe was even required to perform a religious ritual before writing the name of God. Rules governed the kind of ink used, dictated the spacing of words, and prohibited writing anything from memory. The lines and even the letters were counted methodically. If a manuscript was found to contain even one mistake, it was discarded and destroyed. This scribal formalism was responsible, at least in part, for the extreme care exercised in copying the Scriptures. It was also for this reason that there were only a few manuscript copies compared to the Greek New Testament, because the rules demanded the destruction of defective copies. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, 1st century, writes, "We have given practical proof of our reverence for our own Scriptures, for although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured either to add or to remove or to alter a syllable, and it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and if need be, cheerfully to die for them." Time and again, ere now, the sight has been witnessed of prisoners enduring tortures and death in every form in the theaters, rather than utter a single word against the laws and the allied documents. So Josephus continues by making a comparison between the Hebrew respect for Scripture and the Greek regard for their literature. What Greek would endure as much for the same cause? Even to save the entire collection of his nation's writings from destruction, he would not face the smallest personal injury. For the Greeks, they are mere stories improvised according to the fancy of their own authors. And in this estimate, even of the older historians, they are quite justified when they see some of their own contemporaries venturing to describe events in which they bore no part, without taking the trouble to seek information from those who know the facts. Josephus wrote that. Still, however, the earliest Masoretic manuscripts in existence dated from about AD 1000 and later awaited confirmation of their accuracy. That confirmation came with an astounding discovery off the shores of Israel's Dead Sea. So what have we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Actually, in a couple of words, nothing new. Isn't that amazing? 1,000 years difference. The big question was asked first by Sir Frederick Kenyon. Does this Hebrew text, which we call Masoretic, in which we have shown to descend from a text drawn up about 100 AD 100, faithfully represent the Hebrew text as originally written by the authors of the Old Testament books. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the question was, how accurate are the copies we have today compared to the copies of the 1st century and earlier? The earliest complete copy of the Old Testament dates from the 10th century. That's the big question, because the text has been copied over many times. Can we trust it? The Dead Sea Scrolls provide an astounding answer. The scrolls are made up of some 40,000 inscribed fragments. From these fragments, more than 500 books have been reconstructed. Many extra-biblical books and fragments were discovered that shed light on the 2nd century BC to 1st century AD. Religious community of Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. Such writings as the Zadokite documents, rule of the community, the manual of discipline, help us to understand the purpose of daily Qumran life. In the various caves are some very helpful commentaries on the subject. But the most important documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Old Testament text dating from more than a century before the birth of Christ. How were the Dead Sea Scrolls found? Ralph Earl gives a vivid and concise answer to show how the scrolls were found by sharing an account showing God's providential care. The story of this discovery is one of the most fascinating tales of modern times. In February or March of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad was searching for a lost goat. He tossed a stone into a hole in a cliff on the west side of the Dead Sea, about 8 miles south of Jericho. To his surprise, he heard the sound of shattering pottery. Investigating, he found and discovered an amazing sight. On the floor of the cave were several large jars containing leather scrolls wrapped in linen cloth. Because the jars were carefully sealed, the scrolls had been preserved in excellent condition for nearly 1900 years. They were evidently placed there in AD 68. 5 of the scrolls found in Dead Sea, Cave 1, as it is now called, were bought by the bishop of the Syrian Orthodox monastery at Jerusalem. Meanwhile, 3 other scrolls were purchased by Professor Sukenik of the Hebrew University there. When the scrolls were first discovered, he writes, no publicity was given to them. In November of 1947, 2 days after Professor Sukenik purchased 3 scrolls and 2 jars from the cave, he wrote in his diary, "It may be that this is one of the greatest finds ever made in Palestine, a find we never so much as hoped for, but these significant words were not published at that time." Fortunately, in February 1948, the Archbishop, who could not read Hebrew, phoned in the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem and told about the scrolls. By good providence, the acting director of the school at the moment was a young scholar named John Trevor, who was also an excellent amateur photographer. With arduous, dedicated labor, he photographed each column of the great Isaiah scroll, which is 24 feet long and 10 inches high. He developed the plates himself and sent a few prints by airmail to Dr. W.F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University, who was widely recognized as the Dean of American Biblical Archaeologists. By return mail, Albright wrote, "My heartiest congratulations on the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. What an absolutely incredible find, and there can happily not be the slightest doubt in the world about the genuineness of the manuscript. He dates it about 100 BC. The value of the scrolls. The oldest complete Hebrew MS we possessed before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found from AD 900 on. How could we be sure of their accurate transmission, since before the time of Christ in the 1st century AD was the question? Thanks to archaeology and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now know. One of the scrolls in the Dead Sea caves was a complete MS of the Hebrew text of Isaiah. It is dated by paleographers around 125 BC. This MS is more than 1,000 years older than any MS we previously possessed. The significance of this discovery has to do with detailed closeness of the Isaiah scroll, 125 BC, to the Masoretic text of Isaiah in AD 916, 1,000 years later. It demonstrates the unusual accuracy of the copyists of the scripture over a 1,000-year period. A number of scholars, probably many, Of the 166 words in Isaiah 53, there are only 17 letters in question.